My name is Zoe. I'm 34 years old, and this is the story of how I inherited $9 million, survived a horrific car crash, and discovered the most shocking betrayal from the people I trusted most. You won't believe what happened when my husband Michael's new wife, Jessica, found out about my inheritance while I was lying in that hospital bed, fighting for my life. Imagine waking up from a coma to find the person who was supposed to love you had already moved on with someone else, and they were both planning something that would leave you speechless. This isn't just another story about money or betrayal. It's about how quickly your entire world can crumble and rebuild in ways you never imagined. If you've ever felt like your life took an unexpected turn that changed everything, hit that like button and subscribe because you're going to want to hear how this incredible journey unfolds. And trust me, you've probably never heard anything quite like this before. Picture this. You're driving home from work on a Tuesday evening, thinking about what to make for dinner, when suddenly your phone rings with news that changes your life forever. The voice on the other end tells you that your great-aunt Margaret, whom you barely knew, has left you her entire estate worth $9 million. Your hands are shaking, your heart is racing, and you can barely process the words because this kind of thing only happens in movies, right? But before you can even begin to understand what this means for your future, fate has other plans. Within 24 hours of that life-changing phone call, you're lying unconscious in a hospital bed after a devastating car accident that should have killed you. The doctor said it was a miracle I survived when that truck ran the red light and slammed into my car at 60 miles per hour. My car was completely destroyed, twisted metal and broken glass everywhere, and somehow I walked away with my life, though barely conscious for the first 3 days. The pain was unbearable. Every part of my body screamed in agony, but what hurt more was waking up to an empty room. Michael, my husband of 7 years, wasn't there holding my hand or asking the doctors about my condition. Instead, I found out later that he was at home with Jessica, a woman I thought was just a friend, planning what they would do with my inheritance. You see, money has this strange way of revealing people's true colors, and apparently the news of my inheritance had spread faster than wildfire through our small town. Everyone knew about Great-Aunt Margaret's will before I even had a chance to process it myself, including Michael and Jessica. While I was fighting for my life in that hospital room, they were already discussing how they could get their hands on what was rightfully mine. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound from the accident, because I had trusted these people with my heart and my future. What happened next will shock you to your core, because it's one thing to be betrayed by your husband, but it's another thing entirely when you discover the elaborate plan they had created. They thought I might not survive the accident, and if I did, they had already figured out how to manipulate me into giving them control over my new fortune. But they underestimated one crucial thing. Sometimes when you lose everything, you find a strength you never knew existed. And that's exactly what happened to me in that hospital room when I overheard their conversation. This story isn't just about money, betrayal, or even survival. It's about the emotional roller coaster that happens when everything you thought you knew about your life gets turned upside down in a matter of days. The mix of excitement from sudden wealth, the trauma of a near-death experience, and the devastating pain of betrayal creates a perfect storm of emotions that most people will never understand. 1 minute, you're planning how you'll use your inheritance to build the life you've always dreamed of. And the next minute, you're questioning whether the people closest to you ever truly loved you at all. It's like being given the keys to paradise and then discovering that the people you want to share it with are actually planning to lock you out. If you've ever experienced that gut-wrenching feeling of betrayal from someone you trusted completely, make sure you subscribe and hit that like button because this story will take you through every emotion you can imagine, and I promise you, the ending will leave you speechless. The thing about trauma is that it doesn't just affect your body. It changes the way you see everything and everyone around you. When I was lying in that hospital bed, every beep of the machines reminded me that I was lucky to be alive. But every empty chair beside my bed reminded me that maybe my survival didn't matter to the people who were supposed to care most. The physical pain from broken ribs and a concussion was nothing compared to the emotional pain of realizing that my husband had been living a lie for months. Jessica wasn't just a friend who came around occasionally. She had been his secret girlfriend, and they had been planning their future together long before my accident ever happened. What makes this story even more heartbreaking is that I had been so focused on trying to be the perfect wife to Michael that I completely missed all the signs of his betrayal. He would come home late from work, claiming he had extra projects to finish, when he was actually spending time with Jessica. He stopped asking me about my day, stopped planning weekend activities with me, and when I tried to talk to him about our future, he would change the subject or find excuses to leave the room. Looking back now, I realized that our marriage had been crumbling for months, but I was so determined to make it work that I ignored every red flag. The cruel irony of inheriting $9 million at the exact same time my life was falling apart wasn't lost on me. Here I was, suddenly wealthy enough to travel the world, buy my dream house, or start any business I wanted, but the person I thought I'd share these dreams with had already chosen someone else. Money is supposed to solve problems, but in my case, it created new ones that I never could have anticipated. It revealed the truth about relationships I thought were solid, exposed greed in people I thought were genuine, and forced me to question everything I believed about love, loyalty, and trust. But here's what I learned during those dark days in the hospital. Sometimes the worst things that happen to you become the catalyst for the best changes in your life. The accident that nearly killed me also saved me from wasting more years with someone who didn't deserve my love or loyalty. The inheritance that attracted people with bad intentions also gave me the freedom to rebuild my life exactly the way I wanted it. And the betrayal that broke my heart also opened my eyes to who my real friends were and what kind of person I wanted to become. Before that life-changing phone call, my life was pretty ordinary, and honestly, I was struggling more than I like to admit to anyone, including myself. Michael and I were living paycheck to paycheck, working long hours just to keep up with our mortgage, car payments, and the mountain of credit card debt that seemed to grow bigger every month. I was working as a marketing coordinator at a small company, making barely enough to cover my half of the expenses, while Michael worked in construction, which meant some months were good, and others were practically nothing. We had been talking about starting a family for years, but every time we sat down to look at our finances, we realized we could barely take care of ourselves, let alone a baby. It felt like we were running on a treadmill that never stopped, working harder and harder but never actually getting anywhere, and I was starting to wonder if this was just what adult life was supposed to feel like. Every morning, I would wake up at 6 a.m, make coffee in our tiny kitchen, and check our bank account on my phone, hoping that somehow overnight our financial situation had magically improved. The stress of constantly worrying about money was eating away at our marriage, even though we rarely talked about it directly because we were both too proud to admit how scared we were. Michael would come home exhausted from physical labor, covered in dust and sweat, and I would be drained from dealing with demanding clients and unrealistic deadlines at work. We would sit on our worn-out couch, eating takeout we couldn't really afford, watching Netflix shows we had seen 100 times because we were too tired to even have a real conversation. Looking back now, I realized that the financial pressure was slowly killing the connection we once had, replacing love and laughter with stress and silence. The worst part wasn't even the lack of money. It was the feeling that we were stuck in a life that was smaller than what we had dreamed of when we first got married. We used to talk about traveling to Europe, buying a house with a big backyard where we could have barbecues with friends, maybe even starting our own business together. But as the years went by, those dreams felt more and more impossible, like fairy tales we had told ourselves when we were young and naive. I remember one particularly difficult month when our car broke down, and we had to choose between fixing it and paying our rent on time, and I just broke down crying in the mechanic's parking lot because I felt so helpless and trapped. Michael held me while I sobbed, and we both knew that this wasn't the life we had planned. But we didn't know how to change it without taking risks we couldn't afford to take. What made it even harder was watching our friends seem to have it all figured out while we were barely keeping our heads above water. Social media was torture because everyone else appeared to be buying houses, taking vacations, getting promotions, and living these perfect lives that felt completely out of reach for us. I started avoiding social gatherings because I was embarrassed about our financial situation and tired of making excuses for why we couldn't go out to dinner or contribute to group gifts for weddings and baby showers. The isolation made everything worse because we stopped connecting with the people who might have supported us through the tough times, and instead we just focused on surviving each day without falling further behind. But here's the thing about struggling. It teaches you what really matters, even if you don't realize it at the time. Those difficult years showed me that I was stronger than I thought, that I could work multiple jobs when necessary, that I could find creative solutions to problems that seemed impossible. I learned to appreciate small victories, like finding a $20 bill in an old coat pocket or getting a discount on groceries that meant we could afford to buy the good coffee that week. Most importantly, I thought it was bringing Michael and me closer together as we faced these challenges as a team, supporting each other through the hardest moments and celebrating the smallest wins together, though I later learned that he had a very different perspective on our struggles and our partnership. That Tuesday started like any other ordinary day, but sometimes ordinary days become the most extraordinary turning points in your life, and this was definitely one of those days that I'll never forget. I had just finished a particularly stressful meeting with a difficult client who wanted to completely change their marketing campaign at the last minute, and all I wanted was to get home, take a hot bath, and maybe order pizza with Michael while we watched something mindless on TV. The phone call from the lawyer about Great Aunt Margaret's inheritance had left me in complete shock, and I was still trying to process what $9 million would mean for our future when I got behind the wheel of my car. Have you ever received news so big that it completely changes everything you thought you knew about your life's possibilities? And if so, hit that like button and subscribe because you're about to hear how quickly everything can change from the best day of your life to the worst, and trust me, what happened next will leave you completely speechless. I remember driving down Maple Street, the same route I had taken home from work hundreds of times before, when my phone rang again. This time it was Michael, and I was so excited to share the incredible news about the inheritance that I pulled over to the side of the road to take the call safely. I was practically bouncing in my seat as I told him about Great Aunt Margaret, the $9 million, and how this was our chance to finally have the life we had always dreamed of together. But his response wasn't what I expected. Instead of excitement or joy, there was this strange silence on the other end of the line, followed by a very flat, "Okay, we'll talk about it when you get home," that left me feeling confused and deflated. I hung up the phone feeling like something was off, but I pushed those feelings aside because I was still too excited about our newfound fortune to let his weird reaction ruin the moment. As I pulled back onto the road, I was so lost in thought about all the possibilities that the inheritance would bring that I didn't notice the truck running the red light until it was too late. The impact happened so fast that I didn't even have time to scream. One second I was thinking about the house we could buy and the trips we could take, and the next second there was this horrible sound of crushing metal and breaking glass. The world seemed to move in slow motion as my car spun around and finally came to a stop against a telephone pole, steam rising from the crumpled hood and the smell of gasoline filling the air. I could taste blood in my mouth and feel warm liquid running down my face. But the strangest thing was that I felt very calm and detached, as if I was watching this happen to someone else rather than experiencing it myself. The paramedics later told me that I was unconscious for almost 20 minutes before they could get me out of the car, and that it was a miracle that the car didn't catch fire because the impact had damaged the fuel line. I have vague memories of sirens, bright lights, and people shouting medical terms that I didn't understand, but mostly those first few hours are just a blur of pain and confusion. The doctor said I had 3 broken ribs, a severe concussion, a fractured wrist, and internal bleeding that required immediate surgery to repair. For 3 days, I drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes aware of the beeping machines and the antiseptic smell of the hospital, and other times lost in strange dreams where I was trying to call Michael but couldn't remember his phone number. When I finally woke up fully on the 4th day, the first thing I noticed was how quiet my hospital room was. No flowers, no get well cards, no sign that anyone had been there to check on me. The nurse, a kind woman named Patricia, gently explained that I had been in a serious accident and that I was lucky to be alive. But when I asked about my husband, she got this uncomfortable look on her face and said that he had been contacted but hadn't been able to visit yet due to work commitments. Something about the way she said it made my stomach drop, and I knew instinctively that there was more to the story than she was telling me, but I was still too weak and medicated to push for answers that I probably wasn't ready to hear anyway. Waking up in that hospital room was like emerging from the deepest, darkest cave and suddenly being hit by blinding sunlight. Everything felt too bright, too loud, and completely overwhelming. The first thing I became aware of was the constant beeping of machines around me, then the sharp pain that seemed to radiate from every part of my body, and finally, the devastating silence that comes from being completely alone in a moment when you need someone the most. I kept expecting Michael to walk through that door with flowers, or at least a worried expression on his face, but hour after hour passed, and the only visitors I had were nurses checking my vitals and doctors asking me to rate my pain on a scale of 1 to 10. The emotional pain was definitely a 10. But I couldn't explain that to them because how do you tell medical professionals that your heart is breaking faster than your bones are healing? If you've ever woken up from a traumatic experience expecting comfort from loved ones, only to find yourself facing it alone, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like because what I discovered about my husband's absence will shock you more than the accident itself. The physical recovery was actually the easy part, compared to the mental and emotional trauma of those first few days in the hospital. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the sound of the truck hitting my car, and every time I opened them, I was reminded that the person who promised to love me in sickness and in health was nowhere to be found. I started making excuses for Michael in my head. Maybe he was dealing with insurance companies. Maybe he was too traumatized by almost losing me to face seeing me in the hospital. Maybe he was working extra hours to cover my medical bills. But deep down, I knew that none of these excuses made sense because if someone you love is fighting for their life, you drop everything and stay by their side, no matter what else is happening in your world. Patricia, my favorite nurse, became like a guardian angel during those lonely days, bringing me extra blankets, sneaking me better food from the cafeteria, and most importantly, listening when I needed to talk about my fears and confusion. She had been working in the hospital for over 20 years, and she had this gentle way of asking questions that helped me process what I was experiencing without making me feel judged or pathetic. When I finally worked up the courage to ask her directly if she knew why my husband hadn't visited, she sat down on the edge of my bed and said something that I'll never forget. "Honey, sometimes accidents don't just reveal who we really are, they reveal who the people around us really are too." The loneliness was so intense that I started talking to my reflection in the small mirror above the sink, practicing what I would say to Michael when he finally showed up. I rehearsed different versions of the conversation, sometimes angry, sometimes hurt, sometimes just desperate for an explanation that would make sense of his absence. I imagined him rushing through the door with tears in his eyes, apologizing for not being there sooner, explaining that he had been taking care of all the practical things so that I wouldn't have to worry about anything when I got home. But as the days turned into a week and the week stretched longer, I realized that I was creating a fantasy version of my husband that probably didn't exist anymore, if it ever had. The hardest part wasn't even the physical pain or the loneliness. It was the slow, dawning realization that maybe I didn't know Michael as well as I thought I did. Marriage is supposed to be a partnership where you face life's challenges together, where you show up for each other especially during the worst moments, and where love means putting the other person's needs before your own when they're vulnerable and scared. But lying in that hospital bed, surrounded by get-well cards from co-workers I barely knew while my own husband remained absent, I started to understand that our marriage might have been more fragile than I ever imagined, and that the inheritance might have complicated things in ways I hadn't anticipated. When Michael finally called me on day 8 of my hospital stay, I was so relieved to hear his voice that I almost started crying before he even said hello. His first words weren't, "How are you feeling?" or "I'm so sorry I haven't been there." Instead, he launched straight into a detailed explanation about work deadlines, insurance paperwork, and all the practical things he had been handling while I was recovering. Something about his tone felt rehearsed and distant, like he was reading from a script rather than talking to his wife who had almost died. But I was so desperate for connection that I ignored the red flags and focused on the fact that he was finally reaching out. He promised to visit the next day, and I spent the entire night planning what we would talk about, how we would start rebuilding our life together with the inheritance money, and how this traumatic experience might actually bring us closer together as a couple. Have you ever been so hopeful about reconnecting with someone that you overlooked obvious signs that they had already emotionally checked out? And if so, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button, because what happened during that first visit will reveal just how much Michael had changed during my absence. When he walked into my hospital room the next afternoon, I immediately noticed that something was fundamentally different about him, not just his appearance. Though he looked more put together and relaxed than someone whose wife had been in a serious accident should look. There was this emotional distance in his eyes, like he was visiting a stranger rather than the person he had promised to spend his life with. And when he hugged me, it felt mechanical and obligatory rather than filled with relief and love. He sat in the chair beside my bed, but he positioned himself so that he wasn't really facing me directly, and he kept checking his phone throughout our conversation as if he had somewhere more important to be. I tried to bring up the inheritance and how it could change our future together, but every time I mentioned our shared plans or dreams, he would nod politely and change the subject to something practical, like medical bills or insurance claims. The conversation felt like we were two actors who had forgotten their lines and were improvising badly, with long, awkward silences punctuated by superficial updates about things that didn't really matter. He told me about work projects I had never heard him mention before, mutual friends who had supposedly asked about me, though none of them had visited or called, and neighborhood gossip that felt completely irrelevant given what I was going through. When I asked him directly why he hadn't been to see me sooner, he gave me this vague explanation about not wanting to interfere with my medical care, and thinking it was better to let me rest and recover without distractions. The excuse felt hollow and insulting, especially since I had been desperately lonely and would have given anything to have him hold my hand during the scariest moments of my recovery. What hurt the most wasn't even his absence or his distant behavior. It was the realization that he seemed almost relieved by the accident, as if it had given him permission to step away from our marriage without having to explain himself. He kept talking about how this experience had made him reevaluate priorities and think about what really matters in life. But instead of those revelations bringing him closer to me, they seemed to be pushing him further away. When I tried to talk about how scared I had been, how much pain I was in, or how lonely the hospital had been without him, he would listen politely but respond with generic statements like, "I'm sure that was really hard," rather than the empathy and emotional support I desperately needed from my husband. By the time he left that evening, I felt more alone than I had when I was actually by myself, because at least when I was alone, I could maintain the illusion that he still cared about me and our marriage. His visit had shattered that illusion and replaced it with the painful truth that somewhere during my recovery, I had become more of an obligation than a priority in his life. As I watched him walk out of my hospital room, checking his phone again before he even reached the elevator, I knew with absolute certainty that our marriage was over, even if neither of us had said it out loud yet, and that the inheritance money that was supposed to represent our new beginning together was actually going to become the center of a battle I never saw coming. When I tried to share my excitement about the inheritance with Michael over dinner a few days after receiving the news, his complete lack of enthusiasm was so obvious that it felt like a slap in the face. I had spent the entire day researching investment options, looking at houses we could afford, and planning the conversation where we would finally be able to dream together about our future without the constant weight of financial stress holding us back. But as I spread out printouts of beautiful homes and vacation destinations across our kitchen table, Michael barely glanced at them before turning his attention back to his phone, scrolling through whatever was more interesting to him than the most important news of our entire relationship. When I asked him directly what he thought about buying a house with a swimming pool, he shrugged and said, "Sure, whatever makes you happy," as if I was talking about rearranging furniture instead of completely transforming our lives. The disconnect between my excitement and his indifference was so jarring that I actually wondered if he was in shock or if there was something wrong with him that was preventing him from processing what this inheritance could mean for us as a couple. His lack of interest wasn't just disappointing. It was genuinely confusing because this inheritance represented everything we had been struggling toward for years of our marriage. We had spent countless nights lying in bed, talking about how different our lives would be if we could just get ahead financially, if we could stop living paycheck to paycheck, if we could afford to take risks and pursue our dreams instead of just surviving. Now that opportunity was literally sitting on our kitchen table in the form of real estate listings and travel brochures, but Michael seemed more interested in whatever was happening on his phone than in engaging with the reality that our biggest problems had just been solved. When I asked him if he wanted to call in sick to work the next day so we could go house hunting together, he looked at me like I had suggested we rob a bank, telling me that he couldn't just drop his responsibilities because we had some money now. The emotional distance became even more apparent when I tried to initiate physical intimacy, thinking that maybe celebrating our good fortune together would help reconnect us and remind him of why we were a team. But even during what should have been intimate moments, I could feel that his mind was somewhere else entirely, going through the motions of being my husband while emotionally being completely absent from our relationship. He would check his phone immediately before and after any physical contact, as if he was reporting in to someone about his whereabouts or activities. And when I tried to talk to him about how excited I was about our future, he would give me these generic responses that made it clear he wasn't really listening to what I was saying. What hurt the most was the realization that my husband, the person who was supposed to be my biggest supporter and closest ally, seemed almost annoyed by my happiness about the inheritance. Instead of celebrating with me or even showing curiosity about how this windfall had happened, he acted like my excitement was an inconvenience that was disrupting his routine and demanding too much of his attention. When I suggested that we should probably meet with a financial advisor together to make smart decisions about investing the money, he told me to handle it myself, since it was my inheritance, completely missing the point that we were supposed to be partners who made major life decisions together, regardless of whose name was on the paperwork. By the end of that week, I started to understand that Michael's indifference to the inheritance wasn't about being overwhelmed or needing time to process the news. It was about the fact that he was no longer invested in our shared future, and therefore didn't care about opportunities that would benefit us as a couple. His emotional withdrawal had progressed to the point where even $9 million couldn't generate genuine enthusiasm for building a life with me, which should have been a clear sign that our marriage was already over in his mind, even if he hadn't found the courage or the right opportunity to make that official yet. The inheritance that should have been the beginning of our happiest chapter together was instead revealing just how far apart we had grown and how little he valued our partnership. The first time I saw Jessica walk into my hospital room, I knew immediately that something was very wrong, but I couldn't have predicted just how calculated and threatening her presence would turn out to be. She appeared on my 10th day in the hospital, carrying flowers, and wearing this perfectly sympathetic expression that seemed practiced rather than genuine, introducing herself as a friend who wanted to check on me during this difficult time. But there was something about the way she looked around my room, taking inventory of my belongings and studying the medical charts at the foot of my bed, that made my skin crawl with an instinct I couldn't quite name at the time. She asked very specific questions about my recovery timeline, my insurance coverage, and whether I had been able to handle any important paperwork while I was in the hospital. Questions that seemed too personal and detailed for someone who claimed to be just a concerned acquaintance. If you've ever met someone who made you feel instantly uncomfortable but you couldn't explain why, make sure you subscribe and hit that like button, because what I discovered about Jessica's true motives will show you just how far some people will go to get what they want, and trust me, her plan was more sinister than anything I could have imagined. What struck me as particularly odd was how much Jessica seemed to know about my personal life and current situation, information that she could have only gotten from Michael, or from someone who had been carefully gathering details about me for quite some time. She mentioned specific conversations Michael and I had about our financial struggles, referenced inside jokes that only someone very close to our relationship would understand, and even brought up concerns about my emotional state following the accident that felt more like she was fishing for information than expressing genuine care. When I thanked her for the flowers and told her it was kind of her to visit, she sat down in the chair beside my bed without being invited and made herself very comfortable, as if she belonged there and had every right to be part of my recovery process. During that first visit, Jessica kept steering the conversation toward my inheritance and my plans for the future, asking probing questions about whether I had made any decisions about investments or major purchases. She seemed particularly interested in whether Michael and I had discussed how the money would be managed, whether we had joint accounts, and what my intentions were regarding our shared assets and financial planning. At the time, I thought she was just being conversational and maybe offering to help with practical matters during my recovery, but looking back, I can see that she was conducting reconnaissance, gathering intelligence about my financial situation that she and Michael could use to their advantage. The most unsettling part of her visit was the way she talked about Michael, with an intimacy and familiarity that went way beyond casual friendship. She mentioned details about his work schedule, his preferences, and his thoughts about various topics with the confidence of someone who spent significant time with him and knew him very well. When I made a comment about how helpful he had been during my recovery, she got this strange look on her face and said something like, "Michael has been under a lot of stress lately, trying to balance everything," as if she knew more about his emotional state than I did, which should have been impossible if she was just a friend who occasionally socialized with us. By the time Jessica left that evening, I had this nagging feeling that her visit had been more about gathering information than offering support, and that there were layers to her relationship with Michael that I didn't understand. She hugged me goodbye with what felt like false warmth and promised to check on me again soon, but something about the way she said it sounded more like a threat than a kindness. As I watched her walk out of my hospital room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just been visited by someone who saw me as an obstacle rather than a person deserving of genuine care and concern, and that this woman who claimed to be a friend was actually planning something that would change my life in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. The moment of truth came on my 14th day in the hospital when I overheard a phone conversation that shattered every remaining illusion I had about my marriage and opened my eyes to the full scope of Michael and Jessica's betrayal. I had been dozing on and off due to pain medication when I heard Michael's voice in the hallway outside my room, speaking in hushed but urgent tones to someone on his phone. At first, I thought he was talking to his boss or dealing with some work crisis, but as I listened more carefully, I realized he was discussing me, my recovery, and most shocking of all, strategies for gaining access to my inheritance money before I was discharged from the hospital. The words I heard coming from my husband's mouth were so cold and calculating that I actually wondered if I was hallucinating from the medication, because the man I had married would never talk about me like I was just an obstacle standing between him and a fortune. Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted completely had been living a double life and planning to betray you in the worst possible way? And if so, please subscribe and hit that like button, because what I heard during that phone conversation will reveal just how far people will go when money and greed corrupt their hearts and minds. As I listened to Michael's side of the conversation, it became horrifyingly clear that he and Jessica had been planning this betrayal for months, long before my accident had ever happened. He was explaining to her how my extended hospital stay had actually worked in their favor, because it gave them more time to research my legal options and figure out how to position themselves advantageously when I was finally released. The way he talked about me was devastating, not as his wife who had nearly died and was still recovering from serious injuries, but as someone whose emotional vulnerability could be exploited to make her more agreeable to their financial plans. He mentioned that I would probably be grateful for any support when I got home, and that my guilt about the medical bills could be used to convince me that sharing the inheritance was the right thing to do for everyone involved. What made the conversation even more sickening was hearing Michael discuss intimate details about our marriage and my personality traits, as if they were weaknesses that could be weaponized against me. He told Jessica that I had always been too trusting and eager to please, characteristics that they could manipulate to their advantage during negotiations about the money. He even mentioned specific conversations we had about feeling guilty for inheriting money we hadn't earned, suggesting that they planned to use my own moral concerns against me to convince me that I should share the wealth with people who had been there for me during difficult times. The clinical, strategic way he analyzed my character and our relationship made me realize that I had been married to a stranger who saw me as a mark rather than a partner. The most devastating part of the conversation was when Michael started talking about their timeline and what would happen once I was out of the hospital and back home. He assured Jessica that he would be able to maintain the facade of being a caring, supportive husband long enough to gain access to the inheritance funds, and then they would be free to pursue their relationship openly without having to worry about financial security. He even joked about how convenient it was that I had been in an accident right after learning about the inheritance, because it meant I would be emotionally dependent on him during such a crucial time in handling the money, making me easier to manipulate and control. As I lay in that hospital bed listening to my husband plot against me with another woman, I felt something inside me change forever. Not just heartbreak or anger, but a cold, clear understanding that I was completely on my own and would need to protect myself from people I had trusted with my life. The accident that had nearly killed me had actually saved me from wasting more years with someone who saw me as nothing more than a pathway to wealth and comfort. And while the pain of this revelation was almost unbearable, it also filled me with a determination to ensure that their cruel plan would never succeed. I realized that they had underestimated me completely, assuming that trauma and isolation would make me weak and compliant, but instead, their betrayal was about to awaken a strength and strategic thinking that I never knew I possessed. The days following that devastating phone conversation were some of the darkest of my entire life, but they were also the beginning of the most important transformation I would ever experience as a human being. I felt like I was grieving the death of two people, the husband I thought I had married and the friend I thought I had trusted, while simultaneously trying to heal from physical injuries that seemed insignificant compared to the emotional devastation I was processing. Every time a nurse would ask how I was feeling, I wanted to tell them that my heart was more broken than my ribs, that my trust had been more shattered than my wrist, and that the deepest wounds I was carrying couldn't be treated with medication or physical therapy. But instead of falling apart completely, something unexpected began to happen. I started to discover parts of myself that I had forgotten existed during years of trying to be the perfect, accommodating wife to someone who didn't deserve my devotion. The first step in my healing process was accepting that I had been living in denial about the state of my marriage for much longer than I wanted to admit to myself. As I lay in that hospital bed with nothing to do but think, I started remembering all the times Michael had shown me who he really was, but I had chosen to ignore the evidence because I was so invested in maintaining the fantasy of our happy partnership. The late nights, the secretive phone calls, the emotional distance, the lack of interest in our shared future. All of these warning signs had been right in front of me, but I had explained them away because I wanted so desperately to believe that we were working through our problems together, rather than growing apart permanently. Once I stopped making excuses for Michael's behavior and started seeing our relationship clearly, I began to understand how much of myself I had sacrificed in trying to save a marriage that was already over. I had been working extra hours to contribute more financially, cutting back on personal expenses and social activities to save money for our shared goals, and constantly trying to be more understanding, more supportive, more accommodating to someone who was using my efforts to fund his escape from our life together. The woman I had become during those final months of our marriage, anxious, isolated, constantly second-guessing herself, wasn't the real me. She was a version of myself that I had created in response to living with someone who was slowly withdrawing his love and respect while pretending that everything was normal. The process of rediscovering my authentic self began with small acts of self-advocacy that felt revolutionary after years of putting Michael's needs and moods before my own. I started telling the nurses exactly what I needed instead of apologizing for being too much trouble. I began setting boundaries with visitors who drained my energy instead of supporting my recovery. And most importantly, I stopped making excuses for Michael's continued absence and started planning for a future that didn't include him. When Patricia, my favorite nurse, commented on how much stronger and more confident I seemed compared to my first week in the hospital, I realized that losing my marriage was actually allowing me to find myself again. The inheritance money, which had initially felt like a blessing that would improve my life with Michael, began to represent something entirely different. Freedom to build the life I actually wanted, rather than the life I thought I was supposed to want. Instead of dreaming about houses and trips that Michael and I would share, I started imagining what it would feel like to make decisions based solely on my own values, interests, and goals. For the first time in years, I felt excited about my future, not because of what I could buy or where I could go, but because I was finally free to discover who I really was when I wasn't constantly trying to save a relationship with someone who had already decided I wasn't worth saving. The hardest decision I faced during my recovery wasn't about what to do with the inheritance money or where to live after leaving the hospital. It was about what kind of person I wanted to become in response to the betrayal that had nearly destroyed me. Part of me wanted revenge, to expose Michael and Jessica's plan publicly and make them pay for every moment of pain they had caused while I was fighting for my life. Another part of me wanted to try forgiveness, to be the bigger person and walk away quietly without causing drama or complications that might consume my energy for months or years to come. But there was a third option that scared me the most: seeking justice. Not out of spite or saintliness, but out of a determination to protect myself and ensure that their betrayal would have real consequences that matched the magnitude of their cruelty. Have you ever been faced with a choice between revenge, forgiveness, or justice when someone has betrayed you at your most vulnerable moment? And if so, please subscribe and hit that like button, because the decision I made will show you that sometimes the most powerful response to betrayal isn't what people expect. And trust me, what happened next changed everything for all three of us in ways none of us could have predicted. The internal battle between these options consumed my thoughts for days as I weighed the potential consequences of each path and tried to imagine what my future self would think about the choice I made during this crucial moment. Revenge felt satisfying when I fantasized about exposing their plan and watching them face public humiliation, but I knew that pursuing that path would tie me to their toxicity for much longer than I wanted to remain connected to either of them. Forgiveness seemed like the mature, evolved response that would allow me to move forward without carrying the weight of anger and resentment, but it also felt like letting them off the hook for behavior that was genuinely cruel and could potentially be repeated with other victims in the future. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that what I really wanted wasn't revenge or forgiveness. It was accountability, consequences, and the assurance that they wouldn't be able to benefit from their betrayal of me. What helped me make my final decision was a conversation with Patricia, who had become not just my nurse but also my confidant and source of wisdom during the most difficult period of my life. She told me about other patients she had cared for who had faced similar betrayals, and how the ones who recovered most completely were those who focused their energy on building their new life rather than tearing down the people who had hurt them. But she also emphasized that protecting yourself isn't the same as seeking revenge, and that sometimes preventing future harm requires taking action that makes betrayers face the full consequences of their choices. Her advice was simple but profound. Don't let them profit from your pain, but don't let your pain profit from keeping them in your life longer than necessary. The urgency of making this decision became even more intense when I realized that time was not on my side. Michael and Jessica were already implementing their plan while I was still physically weak and emotionally vulnerable from the accident. Life wasn't going to give me another chance to reclaim my power and protect my future if I didn't act decisively while I still had the element of surprise and the legal advantage of knowing about their scheme before they realized I had discovered it. Every day that passed was another day they could use to position themselves more advantageously or to manipulate the situation in ways that would be harder for me to challenge later. The inheritance that should have represented freedom and opportunity was becoming a target, and I had to choose between being a victim of their greed or being a strategic opponent who could outmaneuver them at their own game. By the time I was discharged from the hospital 3 weeks after the accident, I had made my decision. I would pursue justice through legal and financial channels that would protect my inheritance while ensuring that Michael and Jessica faced real consequences for their betrayal. But I wouldn't waste my emotional energy on revenge fantasies or public confrontations that would keep me stuck in the past. I hired the best divorce attorney in the city, documented everything I had overheard about their plan, and began the process of legally separating my assets from Michael's access while he still believed that I was naive and trusting enough to fall for his manipulation. The woman who left that hospital was not the same person who had been brought there unconscious and broken. She was someone who had learned that sometimes the most powerful response to betrayal is not anger or forgiveness, but strategic action that ensures justice while preserving your own peace and future happiness. 6 months after leaving the hospital, as I sit in the living room of my beautiful new house that I bought entirely with my own money and decorated according to my own taste, I can honestly say that surviving that accident and discovering Michael's betrayal were the most devastating and simultaneously liberating experiences of my entire life. The accident taught me how precious and fragile life really is, while the betrayal taught me how strong and resilient I could be when everything I thought I knew about love and loyalty was stripped away. What I learned during those dark days in the hospital wasn't just about Michael and Jessica's true characters. It was about my own capacity to endure unimaginable pain and emerge from it with more clarity, confidence, and determination than I had ever possessed before. The inheritance money certainly changed my external circumstances, but the real transformation happened inside me as I realized that I didn't need anyone else's approval, support, or love to build a meaningful and fulfilling life. Sometimes the worst betrayals become the greatest gifts because they force you to discover strengths you never knew you had and to create a future that's entirely your own. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive once my attorney presented evidence of Michael and Jessica's plan to manipulate me into sharing the inheritance under false pretenses. Michael's attempts to claim spousal rights to money he had tried to steal were quickly dismissed when the court heard recordings I had made of his conversations with Jessica about their scheme. Jessica's involvement in the conspiracy also had consequences, as her employer was less than pleased to learn that one of their employees had been planning to defraud someone who had just survived a serious accident. But the most satisfying outcome wasn't their public humiliation or financial penalties. It was the peace that came from knowing that I had protected myself and my future without allowing their betrayal to turn me into someone bitter, angry, or consumed by thoughts of revenge. The house I bought is everything I dreamed of during those lonely nights in our old apartment when Michael and I would argue about money and wonder if we would ever be able to afford the life we wanted. But what makes it truly special isn't the swimming pool, the gourmet kitchen, or the beautiful garden. It's the fact that every decision about this house was made by me, for me, based on what would make me happiest rather than what would accommodate someone else's needs or preferences. I wake up every morning in a space that reflects my personality, my values, and my vision for my future, surrounded by photos of friends who actually showed up during my crisis and mementos from solo trips I've taken to places I always wanted to see. The silence in this house isn't the uncomfortable silence of a failing marriage. It's the peaceful silence of a life lived authentically without the need to constantly negotiate, compromise, or explain myself to someone who doesn't truly value who I am. What I want people to understand from my story is that you don't need a $9 million inheritance to transform your life. You need the courage to face the truth about relationships that are draining your energy, the strength to walk away from people who don't deserve your love, and the determination to rebuild your life according to your own values, rather than other people's expectations. Money certainly made my transition easier and gave me options that most people don't have, but the real work of healing and growth would have been the same regardless of my financial situation. The most important inheritance I received wasn't from Great Aunt Margaret. It was the self-respect and inner strength that I discovered when I stopped trying to save a marriage to someone who was actively betraying me and started focusing on saving myself instead. Looking back now, I'm actually grateful for every painful moment of that experience because it led me to the life I'm living today. A life where I'm surrounded by people who genuinely care about my well-being, where I make decisions based on my own happiness and values, and where I wake up every day excited about the possibilities ahead of me, rather than dreading another day of trying to fix something that was already broken. The accident that nearly killed me actually saved my life by exposing the truth about my marriage before I could waste more years with someone who saw me as an obstacle to his happiness, rather than a partner in building something beautiful together. And while I wouldn't wish betrayal and trauma on anyone, I can honestly say that going through those experiences taught me that I'm capable of surviving and thriving through anything life might throw at me, and that knowledge is more valuable than any amount of money could ever be. As I prepare to share the final chapter of this incredible journey with you, I want you to know that telling this story has been both healing and empowering, because it reminds me just how far I've come from that broken woman lying in a hospital bed, wondering if she would ever trust anyone again. The transformation from victim to survivor to someone who thrives isn't something that happens overnight. It's a daily choice to focus on growth rather than bitterness, on building rather than destroying, and on moving forward rather than staying stuck in the pain of what other people did to you. If this story has resonated with you because you faced similar betrayals or challenges in your own life, please hit that subscribe button and like this video, because sharing our experiences honestly is how we help each other heal and grow stronger. I believe that every person watching this has the potential to overcome whatever obstacles they're facing, and sometimes hearing someone else's story of survival and success is exactly what we need to find the courage to take the first step toward changing our own lives. The final piece of this story will show you that justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about ensuring that the people who tried to hurt you can never do it again. And that's exactly what happened when Michael and Jessica finally realized that they had underestimated the wrong woman. The most important lesson I learned from this entire experience is that betrayal, as devastating as it feels in the moment, can actually be a gift that reveals who people really are before you waste more time and energy on relationships that were never going to fulfill you. Michael and Jessica thought they were clever, planning their elaborate scheme while I was vulnerable and dependent. But what they didn't realize was that their betrayal was actually setting me free from a marriage that was slowly killing my spirit, and a friendship that was built on lies and manipulation. The accident that nearly ended my life became the catalyst for the best chapter of my life, because it forced me to stop making excuses for people who didn't deserve my loyalty and start building a future based on my own values and dreams. Without their betrayal, I might have spent years or even decades in a loveless marriage, trying to fix someone who didn't want to be fixed and sacrificing my own happiness for someone who was secretly planning to abandon me anyway. What strikes me most when I reflect on this journey is how quickly everything can change when you stop trying to control other people's choices and start taking control of your own response to their behavior. For months before the accident, I had been exhausting myself trying to save a marriage to someone who had already emotionally left the relationship, but I was so afraid of being alone that I kept fighting for something that no longer existed. The inheritance money didn't change Michael's character or Jessica's intentions. It simply revealed what had always been true about both of them, that they were people who would prioritize their own comfort and desires over basic human decency and loyalty. Once I accepted this truth and stopped hoping they would become different people, I was able to focus my energy on protecting myself and building the life I actually wanted, rather than the life I thought I was supposed to want. The strategic approach I took to handling their betrayal taught me that justice doesn't always look like revenge, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do to someone who has wronged you is to remove their ability to benefit from their bad behavior while moving on to live your best life. Michael lost not only access to my inheritance, but also his reputation in our community when word spread about his attempt to defraud his hospitalized wife, and Jessica faced professional consequences that affected her career prospects for years to come. But more importantly, I gained something invaluable: the knowledge that I could trust myself to make good decisions under pressure, protect my own interests when necessary, and rebuild my entire life from scratch if circumstances required it. That confidence and self-reliance has been worth more than any amount of money because it means I never have to stay in situations or relationships that don't serve me, knowing that I have the strength and resources to create alternatives. As we move toward the conclusion of this story, I want you to keep in mind that the most shocking revelation isn't what Michael and Jessica did to me. It's what I discovered I was capable of doing to protect and rebuild my own life when everything fell apart. The woman who entered that hospital as a victim of both an accident and a betrayal left as someone who understood her own power and wasn't afraid to use it when justice required action. But there's still one more twist to this story that will show you just how far-reaching the consequences of their plan really were. And trust me, what happened when they realized I had outmaneuvered them completely will leave you with a new understanding of why sometimes the best revenge is simply living well while ensuring that people who try to hurt you face the full consequences of their choices. So make sure you stay tuned for the final chapter where I'll reveal exactly what happened when I confronted them with the evidence of their betrayal.